panelists for today. We have Minister Kukis, the Minister of Finance of Germany. Thank you very much for hosting us here.
Sure.
We have Minister Tene Birahim Ouattara from Côte d'Ivoire. To my left, we have here to my right, Catherine de Bolle, Executive Director of Europol. Thank you so much for being here. And Elisa Diande Madrazo, the President of the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, long colleague of mine. We'll start, first of all, it's exciting to have a discussion on terrorism financing in a security conference. It's not always the case, and I think that is extremely important to have this topic here. We'll address a couple of questions here in the panel, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Just before that, I just want to intervene in a couple of words. I'm the former head of the Israeli Financial Intelligence Unit and head of the delegation to the FATF, currently a fellow at Harvard. And for me as an Israeli, terrorism financing is not a hypothetical question. This is something that we feel every day, and the recent event of October 7th with the Hamas terror attack demonstrate that again. So the discussion here for me is also a personal one, not only a professional one, about the importance of terrorism financing. And it's important to mention that there are still hostages that we all pray to be back soon, safely. So I will start the panel with Minister Kukis, who is hosting us here kindly. Perhaps you could share with us a few words about the German strategy and policy about the combat against terrorism financing. And I think that it's important to note that yesterday you hosted a ministerial conference with all ministers from all over the world, No Money for Terror.
Yep.
Perhaps you could share with us some of your thoughts and outcomes of that.
Yes, very good. So, first of all, many thanks for MSC for hosting this and for establishing the connection to the No Money for Terror conference. I mean, the linkage between terrorism and security is obvious, and the 7th of October shows very directly that the linkages of threats to our overall security from terror acts is very real and very relevant. But what we dug in yesterday is this key question of how can we shut down the lifeblood of terror organizations through cutting off the channels of financing. And I think that's the key issue, because while individual terror acts don't tend to be very expensive and difficult to fund, the maintenance of the organizations that prepare and perpetrate them is actually very expensive. So the question of intercepting and making financing impossible is a highly relevant strategic question. And we really used a few pillars to understand this. First of all, this whole question of multilateral cooperation is absolutely vital, because we see that the organizations operate easily across borders. So for us, it's absolutely vital to maintain the cross-border connection. The second question is, how do we digitize our prosecution authorities, and how do we make sure that while still focusing on the traditional cash instrument of terror financing, how do we make sure that we also track all of the illicit and illegal financing through cryptocurrencies and through digital payment means? The third big topic that we addressed is the question of how do we make sure that the work of nonprofit organization maintains access to the channels of financing, like bank transfers, which are vital for their work. But on the other side, how do we separate the vast majority of good NGOs doing important work from the very few bad ones that disguise behind charitable work or humanitarian work and are in fact funneling money to terror organizations? And the final point that we discussed in great detail was the increasingly visible linkage between organized crime and terror financing, which of course traditionally happens in very opaque ways, but through the work that Europol, FATF, and other organizations have done, we have gotten to the root of the linkages between organized crime and terror financing. So that's the very quick summary, but of course we can dig into any of the topics as you wish.
Thank you. As I was there, it was a very impressive conference. Thank you so much for hosting that. I will turn to President Madrazo. Can you perhaps tell us in a few words, I'm not sure that the audience here is familiar with the FATF, what its mandate and what it does. And in addition to that, as a person that presented yesterday at the conference, what are your observations about the conference, and what would be the main message that you will convey to the ministers from all over the world on what should be done with respect to terrorism financing?
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for hosting such an event at the Munich Security Conference. When we talk about security, and I was listening very closely to the leaders today presenting their speeches and their views, we hear in this conference a lot of security in sense of country to country and geopolitics. What we deal is with security from terrorism, which is very tangible. And if you think of the big events of terrorism in the last 2 decades, they have not only affected heavily societies, but also shaped geopolitics, to the point that you also mentioned, for example, October of 2023. So in that sense, terrorism is extremely linked to security. And we often don't speak of the financing of terrorism. And that's the lifeblood of terrorism. As Minister explained, it is what keeps the networks behind, the enablers. And that's where the FATF sits at, the core organization that sets the standards that every country virtually around the world has, over 200 jurisdictions, to have the tools to prevent, to detect, and to go after the terrorists. We set the standards, but we also assess how countries are complying with these standards, which are for countering terrorism and also countering money laundering. And where we see deficiencies, we don't shy away from identifying those jurisdictions through the known FATF listings. And we work with the countries. It's a collaborative approach. It's not a punitive approach, but we're committed to helping those countries to make sure that there's no safe haven in the world for criminals and terrorists. So that's what we do. My main takeaway from the conference yesterday is that if we want to be strong against terrorism, we need to make the conversation of countering terrorism through the financing of it, part of it, an essential part of it. And that's where ministers of finance and the ministers of finance become crucial. You just saw a minister that is very acquainted with these topics. When we think of terrorism, we think of ministers of defense, we think of ministers of interior, security, but it's the ministers of finance who are often at the center of having the institutions that will prevent those crimes. And my last point is we're not only here to prevent the acts of terrorism, which in Europe, there were 13 acts of terrorism that were prevented last year, 3 of them in the Olympics, where I happened to attend with my kids. And it's very clear for me how we are in the business of helping our societies to be safe. But when terrorists happen, we use financial intelligence to go and get those terrorists. So think of the terrorist attacks of 2015. Between Friday, when the attacks of the Bataclan happened, and Monday, it was financial intelligence which was crucial for the authorities to come into the apartment and fight the perpetrators. So that's an initial view, and happy to hear from you and entertain questions.
Thank you. And as a former intelligence person, I could testify on the many events that were prevented due to financial intelligence. And if we're speaking about the operational perspective, perhaps I will turn to the Europol and asking you, Executive Secretary, what are the sources of funds that terrorists are using? How do they generate revenue? Do you see any particular trends in those aspects?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me. We see, in fact, 3 big sources. Donations, private donations are still very important. And as we are organized worldwide, from each part in the world, you can give sources to a terrorist organization. Second, e-commerce is becoming more and more important. So we see that terrorist groups, they sell merchandising products online, and it's not only for the product that is linked to extreme right wing or to a terrorist organization, but it's also about selling a feeling of commitment. When you buy it, you are part of us, of our environment. And then, of course, sources coming out of criminal activities. As the minister already mentioned, there is a clear link in cases between serious and organized crime and terrorism. At Europol last year, we did publish a threat analysis on the most threatening criminal groups active in the European Union, and a certain percentage of those criminal groups have clear links to terrorism, and this has been proven at the moment. We also have to understand that we are living in a global world. Terrorists are very agile, so they will always look for new opportunities to get funding for their activities.
Thank you so much. And we'll turn perhaps to Africa. And I would like to ask you, Minister, if you could perhaps share with us the unique risks, patterns that terrorists are using in Africa, and how do you cope with those challenges?
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much. We have a very special situation in West Africa, and our countries are very much impacted by terrorism, whether it's in Niger or in Burkina Faso, for example. There are different paths for financing terrorism. It goes from selling cattle. It's also ransoms that are being paid when people are being kidnapped. So you have quite a few different sources for terrorism financing. We see that, unfortunately, our borders are very open, very porous, so it's very easy to have illegal flows and movements across the borders. What we see that we have also a very strong informal economy in Africa. So you have quite the informal financing of different activities and also of terrorist activities. And we have to really catch up quite a bit because we see that the situation right now is very difficult in Africa. When I look at also, for example, all the attacks on gold mines in Burkina Faso, and I think there was an attack also in 2023, and $6 million were stolen, and they certainly went to finance some terrorist organizations. So you see, there are quite a few events that are quite damaging to our activity, to Africa.
Indeed, funding is crucial to organize to terrorism. Before we'll move to the next topic, are there any additional trends and patterns that you would like to share with us from your experience, Minister Koukes or President Madrasa?
Do you want to go first?
No, I think in terms of the income and the sources of income, we need to think of it as traditional and new challenges. So there are traditional challenges that we haven't been able to tackle completely. Of course, cash is king, as we say. Traditional extortion or traffic of goods, especially if it's for territorial control. And the new challenges are technology, crowdfunding, virtual assets, e-platforms, social media as a way to recruit and to attain funds. That's what's under the sun, the traditional and the new. And you need to make sure that authorities can transition from the traditional while still keeping it on focus to the new challenges. And that requires a lot of investment. It requires a change of a mindset. And you need to invest not only on the technology, as we think of it as a device in an office, but to the people that are doing the work. You're transitioning from one type of investigation to another.
I mean, I think this question of the digital world is absolutely crucial. We have to develop a supervisory framework and a regulatory framework to make sure that the growth of distributed ledger technology, crypto technology, and the benefits it offers in terms of innovative power and new use cases for both intercompany and consumer payment systems does not get abused by those who specifically focus on the anonymity aspect of crypto. And we are seeing, of course, that there is a lot of illicit activity going on, and we've made some investigative breakthroughs and been able to seize quite a lot of cryptocurrencies that were being used for illicit activity. But this is certainly an area where we also have to think completely differently about how to empower our authorities both with the legal means that they need and the prosecution means and investigation means that they need, because, of course, investigating a case where there's drug trafficking for cash is a completely different skill set than tracing a system of disguising cash flows that go in the digital space, in the crypto space, etc.
Definitely, and I could also give the audience a couple of examples from recent years that we've seen how terrorist organizations were using cryptocurrencies. For example, crowdfunding used by ISIS and Hamas in recent years. We've also seen Hezbollah turning fiat into crypto, and so on and so forth. So indeed, lots of activity in those fields. As was mentioned earlier, terrorism financing is a global trend and funds are moving from country to country. A crucial thing is international collaboration and cooperation. And I would like to ask all of you, actually, what do you think about the international cooperation, the current mechanism that exists? And perhaps let's speak about what doesn't work well, about the systematic weaknesses that exist and what should be done in order to improve that. We'll perhaps start with
Yes,
Europol.
thank you. Well, as mentioned already by the Minister, cryptocurrencies are very important for terrorist organizations. And the movement of cryptocurrencies is relatively easy. So it is for police forces and for intelligence community very important to have the right expertise and the right tools to go after these cryptocurrencies and to have specialized people in blockchain. And what is legally very difficult is that we will have then the digital environment that is providing the terrorists with the money and the resources to organize their crime. But we have also the need to have the digital evidence. We need to integrate it in a physical file. So you have social media platforms, you have the World Wide Web, you have the dark web, you have the normal web. All these digital tools that are used for sourcing, in fact, criminal organizations, we have to find the right way to get this information into a physical file. And there we see that sometimes we are stuck because our legal framework does not always provide us on an international level to get the digital evidence we need. And second, also technically, we do not always have in law enforcement the right tools to investigate in the digital environment, the right tools or the right skills. So I think that the weakness in the system is sometimes the legal framework, but it's also the access to the right tools to do investigations in the digital environment. And that is why we need to speed up legislation in the digital environment. It takes a lot of time. And we also have to reconsider, I think, what is the right balance between the need from a law enforcement perspective and a justice perspective and the privacy and the data protection. How do we set the balance right? And where do we need to redefine some legal definitions we are confronted with today?
Thank you. We'll turn to Minister Quarta because I know that you need to leave earlier. If you could address the question of international cooperation and perhaps in particular what West African countries could enjoy and benefit more from the international community.
So our situation is quite different to the situation in the Western world in terms of the means that we have to fight against the financing of terrorism. But I have to say that we are, for instance, very interested in what the FATF is doing, and we are respecting their recommendations in terms of the transfer of funds, and we are doing our best to avoid these going to terrorist organizations. But what I would like to say in terms of what could be improved is in terms of the legal framework. Because from one country to the next, from one organization to the next, the legal frameworks are different. And so sometimes there are issues in adapting to these. Let me take a very simple example. Let's take the African Union and the CEO. We have two different organizations but we have a common framework in order to fight against this plague, because otherwise it's very, very difficult. So it's important that we unify our framework so that we can work together, and that's what we're doing here. But it is a challenge to find ways to harmonize regulation in order to really be able to take account of the situation on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your important intervention. Minister Kookes, is there anything that you think that could be improved in the international cooperation mechanisms that you would suggest?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll give you a very specific example. We've adopted the so-called travel rule in cryptocurrency space, where essentially we impose on all of the financial institutions that due diligence both payers and recipients of crypto transactions. That's extremely important, but given that a lot of crypto is completely oblivious to any physical border, by definition, if there's no international cooperation, the rule travels into oblivion, because if you can arbitrage the system by physically locating in countries that don't participate in the implementation, then the rule can be abused immediately. So I think what FATF is doing is extremely important by broadening the membership, the activity beyond the pure membership base of the FATF by creating regional networks of cooperation. So I think this is an extremely important element of the global cooperation, and using global fora is just becoming more vital, because the criminals know very well where the weak links are in our defense mechanisms.
President Madureira, the FATF is, of course, the king of those aspects. Would you like to suggest some input?
Sure. In the spirit of the FATF is that every country is strong within their own system, but that the systems can connect and do connect efficiently. So a lot of what we do is precisely set the standards, the floor standards, not as prescriptive, so each country can choose how they implement it within their framework, but that they're able to share the information. Other ways, the system does not work. And I'll take a couple of examples. The virtual asset sector. The FATF very early recognized that there was a risk there, 2014, which is light ages in terms of virtual assets. And by 2019, we had new standards, updated standards. First organization to define the term, to set standards, asking the countries to register the providers, those that provide service, that exchange, sell fiat to virtual assets and vice versa across the globe, that they supervise and regulate the sectors. And importantly, that they have the travel rule, which means that with every transaction, you know who is sending the virtual asset, who is receiving it. We are doing poorly on one side and greatly on another side. We're doing poorly into that only approximately 40% of the countries have implemented the travel rule. But let me give you a good picture. If you look at the materiality of the virtual assets within a country, we're covering 82%. So if we look at the countries that have more clients or more users of virtual assets and more transactions in terms of volume, the FATF has managed to get countries to cover 82% of the market, but we need 100. We cannot have a safe space. And the other example is beneficial ownership. We changed recently our standards. Again, the FATF was the first organization that defined what beneficial ownership was decades ago. And we just updated them to make sure that each country has the information updated, complete, accessible. But that does not get to the objective we want if it's not interconnected. So now what we need is to make sure that there's also cooperation and collaboration on those fronts.
Thank you so much. And can I address one more question to you before you? Okay. So a quick question, perhaps, how the international community can support low and middle income countries to enhance their system and their abilities to actually implement terrorism financing mechanism to combat that in their jurisdiction. And I think that you could probably teach us on that.
Yes, I think we have some common responsibilities. Because, let's be honest, Africa cannot alone fight against the financing of terrorism. It's not possible to do that without the support of European and Western nations in general. So it's important to have an organization that can support us in our efforts to develop. Because, you know, terrorism is directly linked to poverty in Africa. And it is poverty that is causing terrorism. So it's very important we have support from Western countries to limit the effects of terrorism, but it is also important, and it's been said earlier on by my colleague, it's important that we have better harmonization of rules and regulations, because currently it is quite complex. I come from a country, I will mention again, from the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. We have the effect of terrorism from neighboring countries, from Burkina Faso, for instance. And I have to say, we spend a lot of money to protect our country, but that's money that we could spend in better ways to further develop the country. So, yes, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for this discussion.
Thank you so much for your participation, and have a good travel. So we'll open up the floor now to questions from the audience before I'll continue with my questions. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel discussion. I'm Maisha Alam. I'm Senior Vice President of Research at FP Analytics. And I had a question for really anyone on the panel, which is I'm curious to what extent terrorist organizations are relying on cyber attacks and embedded in the cyber mercenaries market as a form of revenue generation, and what can be done about that.
Great, thank you. Perhaps we'll collect another question if there is one before. Okay, so we'll turn to the experts.
I think it's important nowadays that we recognize that for serious and organized crime and for terrorism, there is always a cyber element. And that terrorists, they have their own specialists in the cyber environment. We as police forces, we also need to have this. In Europol, we did invest in the Internet Referral Unit. That's a unit that is responsible for referring terrorist content online to the company so that they can take the terrorist content offline. It's also a very important tool to monitor, in fact, what is the propaganda, because we see that recruitment and propaganda is done online by terrorist organizations, and they are specialized in developing hashtags to reach out to vulnerable people, young people and vulnerable people, people with moral problems, with moral problems. So what we see is that or they have the competence in-house to develop a kind of digital environment in which they will work, or they hire cybercrime specialists to do the work for them. It's called cybercrime as a service. So we see that they really go online, and the online environment is extremely important for terrorism, for spreading their message, and for recruitment and propaganda.
Any additional responses?
I mean, it's a very good question, and one that you can dissect from many angles. I can't cover all of them, but I'll say that from the FATF work that we have done, that could be interesting for you to answer more your question, is work we did on ransomware. So ransomware, we did that study thinking of the revenues and how it was conducted. But of course, there were cases provided by members of the global network where the securement of a facility or cyber taking hostage of something in some cases had an indication of not only revenue, but something that could be considered terrorism. So I think ransomware is one area to look at. And of course, terrorists do expand in the way that they attain resources. So to the extent that there is a crime that provides that proceeds, they can exploit them. It's not uncommon to see terrorists conduct terrorism, but also other crimes that could be cyber-enabled crimes, of course.
Yeah. And perhaps just to add to that, that cybercrime become so much easy given AI technology that you could actually use fraud GTP, for example, to create the perfect crimes with that very easily in a low-cost version of that without even needed to hire experts for that.
You can download large language models for 60 euros a month and make it your own large language model without safeguards. You can get rid of the safeguards, and then you can use the system for whatever you want. So also terrorists make use of that.
Yeah. So perhaps we'll turn to AI and the innovation that terrorists adapt and on both sides. First, how bad actors can use AI, and the other side is what do you think would be improved in the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing tools, traditional tools that we currently have? Minister?
Yeah, I do think we have to think about what kind of empowerment we give to the prosecution side, because very clearly it's been a legitimate concern and a legitimate policy goal to protect the privacy of consumers and citizens almost to the entirety, and my country is very prominent in this, which makes all the sense in the world. But of course, in the way that we see terrorists conducting crimes, we have to calibrate what we give to our authorities in terms of competencies. I said this yesterday when I heard you speak yesterday about the examples how your prosecution in Israel uses data and intelligence to figure out and track down criminal proceeds. For example, our authorities aren't even allowed to store IP addresses, for example. So I do think in Europe we do have to become a bit more pragmatic, and if we want to combat these sources of funds used for terror, we also have to empower our authorities more, because in Europe it would be just very difficult under the rules and regulations that we have, and in Germany even more specifically, for our authorities to even work with data, because if you can't store it, you usually can't use it.
So we have someone sitting on my right, the former president of the FATF, Dr. Player, and under his presidency in the German presidency of the FATF, there was a lot of work to do in terms of understanding how we could leverage technologies to combat terrorism financing, but also money laundering, but also to encourage this use by the private sector and to diagnose what was, on the way. So both reports are public. I cannot synthesize them, but some things to consider is that the human element was still essential. So it's not a substitution, but it becomes a tool of the authorities. DPP's data protection and privacy laws did come as a challenge because of some restrictions that might in a way in terms of facilitation that technology provides in data pooling, in exchange of information and DPPs. It was clearly a conversation to have. And on that front, we have also done work in the FATF that shows the importance of working with the data protection authorities and our niche of authorities from the beginning while developing, for example, the technology. So it's a conversation to have at an early stage and one that really pays off if you conduct.
Definitely. And I will perhaps add that the new technologies and the ability to process data much easily while protecting privacy with AI tools and additional approaches can yield excellent results for law enforcement and also for the private sector. I think that AI is a perfect solution for compliance and to make sure that we are tracing relevant activities, because you have lots of policies that it is easier to enforce with those tools. I will open the floor, yes, for additional question.
Thank you very much. And mine is not a question, but perhaps a comment. And I'll do it in my capacity as Executive Director of Counter-Terrorism Committee, Executive Directorate of the United Nations Security Council. And we, of course, as part of our core mandate, conduct assessments of all United Nations member states. And a very important part of our assessments is how the states are implementing the provisions of the Security Council resolutions on countering financing of terrorism. We identify gaps, we provide recommendations, but we also very much analyze the evolving trends. And this is what we reflect in our assessment reports. And I just want to highlight this excellent partnership that we have with the Financial Action Task Force Presidency, Madam President, with the Executive Secretariat, because the FATF recommendations, of course, is the core element of our assessments. And of course, we mutually exchange the results of the assessments, trying to complement but not to duplicate each other. So what I wanted to add is, of course, that great partnerships with such entities as Interpol, Europol, Madam Executive Director, UNOCT, who is present together with us, and UNODC, we work together. But what CEDAT is now leading globally under the guidance of the Security Council is a very thorough revision of national counter-terrorism strategies in the countries all over the world. It is our impression, after we've conducted assessments for 20 years, this year CEDAT is 20 years old, is that the previous generation of national counter-terrorism strategies do not adequately respond to the challenges and threats that we are dealing with today, because here in Munich and yesterday in No Money for Terror conference, we've been talking about all government, but also all of the society approach. And this is what is very difficult to achieve. But also when I see this panel today, that is a clear reflection of what needs to be done, because these are, of course, the governments, these are the international partners, and of course, the representatives of the security institutions. So the interagency cooperation and coordination is becoming the key element of the new national security strategies. What we want to achieve there is that the countering financing of terrorism becomes a very important element of those strategies in each particular country. Today, in the plenary sessions, we heard a lot about how important is internal security for each of the member states. I think that was the focus of some of the interventions. How ready we are to make sure that internally we have a good plan of action, a good analysis, and a good interagency cooperation and coordination that involves the whole of the society, that involves private sector, that involves research and academia, civil society, and indeed all those important stakeholders without whom it would not be now conceivable, it would not be possible. So I just want to mention that I welcome very much that this panel was convened and organized today for the broader audience in the Munich Security Conference. And I want very much to commend the German chairmanship of the No Money for Terror process, of course, the president of FATF, for organizing so relevant, so meaningful discussion yesterday, and of course the outcome of those discussions, because that's exactly what the Security Council now signals, instructs all of us in the UN to do, and we will be very happy to join efforts with you so that we are better prepared both internally to counter the threats, but also the international multilateral cooperation will be therefore strengthened. So thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions or comments before we will? Okay, so perhaps we could address and respond to the important things that were mentioned.
Yes, I completely agree on what you say. In Europe, we have a counterterrorism coordinator. He's represented here. And it's very important. He is having the overview of and he's working for the Council of what every state is doing related to terrorism and how we can align more and better. At Europol, we did set up the economic and financial private-public partnership, and this is an extremely good example, and it's also the first one in that area on how to tackle financial crime linked to terrorism. We have the banks, for instance. The financial sector is in that private-public partnership, and the advantage is that we develop together profiles, and the profiles of terrorist organizations, for instance, can be used by the private sector, by the banks, and also by the law enforcement community. And then we can try to find out who is active at what moment in time and which are the groups we have to go behind. I also believe that real operational impact is very important. We need to have the strategies right, but we also need to have our operations right. And then to have a multidisciplinary team that is working on tackling terrorist groups is very important. What we also see that has changed over the years, in Europe we were confronted with very hard terrorist attacks in 2015, 2016. We learned a lot of lessons out of that, and the strategies developed in the different countries did help us in the information exchange, that now when a member state in the European Union is confronted in a very early stage to a possible terrorist attack, the help is there. Europol is involved, other countries are involved, and there is a very good information exchange. And we also see that the silos that existed before between the financial sector, financial intelligence and crime intelligence, that there are less silos, so that we try to disrupt by make a kind of fusion of the data and get the right leads out of that data. So I think in Europe, I can say we made a lot of steps, and also on the international level, we did make a lot of progress, but we can always do better and more.
But I think this is an interesting point, because that is an area where we still need to think about enhancing the cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. I mean, you mentioned the fusion of data, but I think specifically when banks detect patterns that they would like to investigate, we are very often hampered by the fact that the bad guys are very smart about splitting cash flows between banks and between financial institutions. And for the financial institutions to cooperate is very often hindered by the restrictions that we impose. And then whether or not the financial intelligence units and the authorities are able to connect the dots is not always a given, right? So I do think this is an area where, specifically we can still improve our legislative framework quite a bit.
2 points. One, and thank you, Natalia, for those comments. Of course, CITED is a key partner for the FATF and a key partner in combating the financing of terrorism. I think international collaboration between institutions at the multilateral is fundamental, and one thing that we cannot take as a given in nowadays of potential fragmentation. This is something that we need to value and more than ever continue working together. That's one point. And the FATF is committed to it as a global organization with more than 200 jurisdictions. The second point is recognizing that not all the countries have the capabilities and the resources. And I think this is to the point of the Minister of Côte d'Ivoire, who he made a very good point of saying, we try, but sometimes we don't have the capabilities, and sometimes we do need support. And I think to the extent that we see that terrorism is also expanding, it's not that it's moving and moving the other areas, but expanding increasingly to Africa, in particular sub-Saharan, the Sahel area. We need to recognize that those jurisdictions are not as equipped and do not have the capabilities that others have. And to that extent, there's a global responsibility to make sure that we level up the field. So we can have international cooperation, but then the information is there. Otherwise, you can be connected, but if there's nothing in the pipeline, so.
We could probably speak on those topics for a couple of additional hours, but thank you so much to the panelists and to the German government for its commitment to combat terrorism and terrorism financing, and also to mention Dr. Markus Player, the former president of the FATF. During his term, a lot of progress was made on the field as well. Thank you so much, and thank all of you that attended here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.